Good morning, and whatever transpired last night, I'm just happy that we're transitioning into basketball season. And that's what I have to say about that. Right, so yes, I know that Mark Biddle has been in your midst many times, so I bring his greetings and greetings from Sophia Theological Seminary and Sophia Farms, which is the crazy old idea that he came up with when Baptist Theological Seminary Richmond here in Richmond closed. And so we are working together to bring into existence a farm supporting a small seminary. There's more to be told about that, and if I go off on that, you will be here way beyond your lunch and nap time. So I'll stop myself for now on that topic, but happy to talk about that as well if Mark hasn't burned your ears on that subject himself. Specifically, though, for the next 2 weeks, I want to talk about this idea of how the extraordinary exists in the ordinary, and specifically an area that I have done a lot of work in, which is humor in the Bible, particularly the Hebrew Bible, because that's my area of expertise, and how that intersects with the figures in the Old Testament that are women, and what that humor in those stories, what that does for us in our own understanding and interpretation of those stories. So I will be here 2 weeks. So I'm going to do my best to sort of do one story this week and one story next week, but I also understand there'll be some cross-pollination. So particularly if there are questions that come up this week that we don't have time for, or anything that comes up during the week that you want to bring up next week, we'll have that opportunity. So the text that I want us to look at is Genesis 38. So I'm going to get there in a minute, but if you are interested in following along, then you can go ahead and start leafing the pages. I don't have to tell you where Genesis is, I hope. If we were in if we were in Malachi, I might need to give you a hint, but Genesis is a little bit easy to find. So Genesis 38, which is towards the end of the book. But first, I want to do the classic. You put me behind a pulpit, and I'm a Baptist, so there is a danger that a sermon could break out. But in the meantime, I just want to start with a joke, because that's what we do, isn't it? All right, so an atheist went walking in the woods. How beautiful, how amazing, he thought, as he walked and he looked. And then he heard a rustling in the bushes behind him. So turning to look, he saw a massive grizzly bear charging towards him. So the man began to run, but when he turned to look, he tripped and he fell. And rolling over, he saw that the bear was upon him, raising a paw to strike. And the atheist cried out, "Oh my God!" Miraculously, time stopped. The bear froze. The forest was silent. A loud voice from the sky demanded, "You deny my existence for all these years, and now you expect me to help you out of this predicament?" The atheist replied, "Yes, I see that it would be hypocritical of me suddenly in this crisis to ask you to treat me as a believer. Perhaps then, for my sake, you could make the bear a believer." "Very well," said the voice. Time resumed, the sounds of the forest returned, and the bear brought his paws together, bowed his head, and said, "Lord, bless this food which I am about to receive from thy bounty through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen."
That's great.
It's a good one. So when I suggest to folks that there's humor in the Bible, I get a range of responses from, "Yes, that makes sense," to people really questioning the validity of my salvation. But what's true, and this is true like sociologically, anthropologically, that in every culture, in every time, there has been evidence of humor. So even some of the oldest stuff are like paintings on cave walls that show wild animals sitting at a table playing some kind of human game, right? So then what I want to suggest to you is that it would be more odd if we didn't find humor in the Bible. Now, I can accept that part of my job here in these 2 weeks is to help convince you of that. So what I want to propose to do is to show you rather than tell you. So for these 2 weeks, I've chose what are probably lesser known stories of the Hebrew Bible. And so what I want to do is kind of walk through these stories with you. And I'll stop at certain points and insert my own, depending on your perspective, highly reverent or highly irreverent comments. And then I'll leave time at the end for you to grill me. Now, I want to make a couple of points before I start in earnest on Genesis 38. One is that I want to just go ahead and give you permission that it's okay to smile, laugh, giggle, chortle, roll your eyes, elbow your neighbor, whatever, right? So if you need my permission to find this humor, then you certainly have it. The second thing I want to say is that these 2 stories today focus on female, women characters. But also, men are there together with the women. All right? So there might be aspects of these stories that make us a little bit uncomfortable. The sexuality that's involved, but also possibly the ethics related to what's going on there. So what I want to remind you is that these are their own stories. Like there was a choice at some point whether they would keep telling these stories generation after generation or let them die. And then at some point there came a decision as to what they would keep permanently in a written form. So these are their stories. So I say what I always say in these moments, which is any discomfort is ours, not the Bible's. Right? So there's something there for us, even in our discomfort, right? To kind of stop and question where our discomfort is coming from, but also to recognize that we don't have to keep that discomfort. We don't have to hold on to it. We can let it go. Because here's the text. This is our sacred Bible. And if we hold it in some way important to our faith, then there's something here for us, even in our discomfort. All right, so those are my disclaimers. Let's dive into Genesis 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, she named him Shelah. She was in Chezib when she bore him. All right, so this is our most of our cast here. So we have Judah's wife, 3 sons, and a friend of Judah's named Hira. So 2 things are important here. All right, this is the Judah. This is Judah, one of 12. Judah, that Judah. All right, so everything you think you ought to know about one of the patriarchs of Israel, this is that Judah. All right, that's thing 1. Thing 2 is that these are Canaanite people that they're intermingling with. That's not, well, no, let me not say that's not good. Eventually this would be understood to be not good. The Canaanites were, in the Old Testament theology, the Canaanites were the ones who led the Israelites astray. Let's say it like that. The Israelites were to be faithful to this one and only God of theirs, this Yahweh God. But they lived amongst the Canaanites. And so they understood the Canaanites to be ones who would, because they had different worship practices, that when the Israelites behaved like the Canaanites, they got in trouble. And it's a much more significant theological issue than just that simple explanation of it. But if we're trying to sort of get behind and get into the world of this story, to see that these are Canaanite women, it matters. I'm going to jump up and down on that point more later. Okay. All right. And here is going to show up again, the friend. All right. So verse 6. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. All right. This is our star of the show, Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked, evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Don't know why. This is what happened. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." Now that sounds weird, so I'm going to tell you what that means. There's a passage in Deuteronomy 25, and it talks about this thing they call the levirate marriage. And this is the reference here about do the duty of your brother-in-law. So understanding that the land passed down the male line. So if a man died and he did not have a son, this was a problem, right? Now, this is not 2024, so I'm just not advocating that for now. I'm just saying this is how it was set up for them. So it was a problem when these men died and didn't have sons. So in Deuteronomy 25, this is the relevant section of the teaching of the Israelites for this reference here. When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, that's the situation we find ourselves in, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. All right, this is critical. The widow remains an integral part of this core family that she's married into forever. Judah. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. All right? And if you don't do it, you've broken a covenant. All right? So it becomes the responsibility of the next son to father a child, a son, with the widow, so that there is a son to inherit. Now, the critical thing is the son inherits as if his father was the dead man. Not, like, you follow me? So in this case, heir's the dead one. And so a son between Onan and Tamar would inherit as if he was heir's son, not Onan's son. Do y'all know the term Onanism? Yeah, it's an old term for what we're about to read. Again, okay, where are we? We are in, okay. So then Judah, verse 8, then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother. Okay, Judah is telling the middle son to do this. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground, Onanism, whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. This is capital N, not capital G, good, not good. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Judah, 3 sons, now 1. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow where? In your father's house. He sends her away. This woman that has married into his family and is therefore his responsibility forever. He is now telling her, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. That's the third one. Now that's what Judah says to Tamar, but this then is Judah's internal dialogue. For he feared that he too would die, Shelah, would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Now she's not able to marry again because she's already married, even though her husband is dead. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hirah the Adullamite. I told you he'd be back. All right, so sheep shearing shindigs. Sheep shearing was a festival. All right. When Tamar was told, Tamar, who's been sitting around, rejected, in her father's house, waiting for Shelah to grow up. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. Why? She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. All right, one thing, there's a pun here. Entrance in Hebrew is the same as the word for opening, and Enaim, which is presented as a proper noun here as the place name, it also is the word for eyes. So the phrase also means the opening of the eyes. So it's important then in what's to follow, to kind of try to follow the thread of who knows what, who doesn't know what they see, what they don't see. And also to understand that knowing in Hebrew, the single verb means both to know someone cognitively, to recognize them or to be familiar with them, but also to know them, well, that's why we say to know them biblically, right? It also means to have sex, frankly, all right? Okay, so there's this punning going on about the opening of the eyes, who sees, who's blind, what they see, what they know, how they know, right? So Tamar's got on these particular clothes. Yes. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute. Don't let anybody ever tell you that Tamar was a prostitute. All right? There's a clear distinction here. Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. So knowing, not knowing, recognizing, seeing, not seeing. He went over to her at the roadside and said, I've got a proposition for you. He says, come, let me come into you. For he did not know, even though he was about to know her, he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, well, what are you going to pay me since this is clearly a transaction? What she actually said in terms of the Hebrew. What will you give me that you may come into me? He answered, I will send you a kid from the flock. And she said, okay, but I need some collateral. How about your wallet, your passport, your keys, and your driver's license? So what she replied, your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hands. These are very clear identifying possessions. Now, Judah was in some kind of state, apparently, because he said, okay. He went into her. Now, Hebrew is really great. Like, it'll expand, the way it tells a story. It'll expand, and you'll have like 18 verses of dialogue. And then in 3 verbs, it'll tell you 1,000 things. So this is where we have those 3 verbs that tell you 1,000 things. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. All right, the deal is done on both sides. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. Next paragraph. When Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite, he didn't bring the payment himself, he sent his friend. To recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. Well, shock and all that. He asked the townspeople, where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside? Now, there's a little twist happening here because there's 2 words in the Hebrew Bible for prostitute, because there's transactional, sex for money, prostitute kind of person, profession. There was also then those who, and we don't really know much about these, but we do have evidence there were also those who were sort of designated in a consecrated kind of way for purposes that had to do with sexual activity. And they call them temple prostitutes. It's a different word. But they were considered okay. All right, so there's a little kind of cleaning up the story here when Hira says, where is the temple prostitute who is at Enaim by the wayside? They said, no prostitute has been here. So he returned to Judah and said, I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said, no prostitute has been here. Judah replied, let her keep the things as her own, otherwise we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid and you could not find her. So here's Hira walking up and down the road, trailing a goat. Have you seen that prostitute? Have you seen that prostitute? And Judah's worried that they're going to be laughed at, to the point that he's okay with her keeping his passport, his keys, and his driver's license. Judah, that is that Judah. Just keep remembering that. About 3 months later, here's where you hear the gong of doom. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom. I mean, the NRSV is like getting spicy with the language. And Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. because this would have been considered unfaithfulness to the dead husband. Judah. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, if you will please take receipt of this little package of a driver's license and a set of keys and a passport, and if you could find the owner of these, that's the person who made me pregnant. Master stroke. All right, and here's where we transition from the humorousness of this to where it gets theologically so incredibly significant that we just need to be blown out of the water by this. Then Judah acknowledged them. He finally, for the first time, did something right. God love him. And he said, "She is more righteous than I am." This is that Judah. And this is Tamar, the Canaanite. She is more righteous than I am, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not lie with her again. Now, I want to say a couple things about what it means to be righteous in the context of the Old Testament. So we sort of have this sense of like a spiritual person I can like go in the corner and be righteous by myself, right? But the way the Hebrew Bible understands things is all these things are things that are lived out in community, right? So to be righteous means that in your relationships with others in your community, you do right acts, right? And that applies to everything, justice, right? So justice is not some sort of concept. Justice is to do just things within your community. The same with love. So you hear this, like we have this phrase now that love is a verb. The Hebrew Bible knew that love was a verb from the jump, right? That the way you show love is to do loving things. And so Judah is now saying that a foreigner, a Canaanite, is not even an Israelite. He's not even held to the terms of the Torah that the Israelites are meant to uphold, who tricked him and took his stuff and disappeared on him, and all that stuff that she did, that scheme that she had, that she in the end was more righteous than him, that she demonstrated more right acts than he did. All right, so I have a question for you. To go back to that opening joke, right? I think we recognize it generally as funny, but what was funny about it? Like if you had to say why was it funny, how might you answer that question? It's not a trick question. I mean, it's a genuine question. I wouldn't necessarily expect people to have the same answer. But if you experienced it as funny, what was funny about it?
Because it dealt with somebody other than yourself.
Yeah, right. So he thought he was asking for something for himself, and it didn't turn out that way. Is that what you mean? Right? Other reasons why you might have experienced it as funny? What made you laugh?
It wasn't what he was expecting.
It wasn't what he was expecting, which also means then it wasn't what you were expecting. Yeah. So this is the phenomenon of comedy. Like if you say, how do you define it? People just like go slack-jawed like, right? Because it's hard to define. We recognize it. We experience it. And so we say, aha. In hindsight, we say, that was funny. I experienced that as funny. That was funny to me. Or humorous, even. If you didn't, you might not have laughed, but you could still experience it as funny. So, and this is true, like, this is universally true. I've written a book about comedy in which I had to say, to start with, there's no good definition of comedy, right? There isn't a single definition. But I'm not going to leave you there. One of the things that seems to unite most kinds of comedy is that it has some form of incongruity in it. So this exact thing of what you expect is not what you get. And when you say it that kind of simply, you can see how broad that can be. So that can apply to so many kinds of things. So in the joke, you thought that, or this person thought that he was asking for something for himself, and it turned out that this voice from the sky enabled the bear instead, right? Or even just the incongruity that an atheist has the audacity to call on God. Or was that even to call on God, right? So there are incongruities in there that then bring you to that final incongruity that's in the punchline.
It was also, I think, bless this food is also relatable to everybody. Right?
Yes.
We all pray, we all say that blessing.
Which is also a good point about expectation, because expectation assumes that you have some familiarity with it, right? So you can only expect something. So like in Genesis, we might have an expectation about how a patriarch named Judah should behave, right? Because we know something about the story and we know who Judah is, right? We didn't just meet Judah in Genesis 38, and we keep encountering Judah into all the way through to the point that Judah then, when Israel and when Israel becomes a divided nation later on, there's Israel and there's Judah. And we lose the other 10 tribal names, and even just in retaining those 2, one of them is Judah. Yeah.
Not read your book, so I'm not sure what it says, but I do remember many, many years ago reading a book on comedy. And the explanation was that comedy is when bad things happen to other in your presence.
Ah, yes.
Tragedy is when the bad thing happens to you.
Yes. That is comedy. I mean, it's an interesting thing. Like, we have such a familiar relationship to comedy on the one hand. Like, it infuses our being. Even if you are a humorless person, there's still, comedy still infuses our world. And so how we experience it is so incredibly complex. And this phrase we have, a sense of humor, right? In that is an understanding that everybody's perception of humor is different. And this issue of perspective, right? Are you the butt of the joke? Are you the one telling the joke? Are you the one standing by while the joke is being told? And you can even hold more than one position in that situation at the same time. And I'll use that then to transition to the another point I want to make, which is that then comedy exists in itself as a thing, right? But it also exists for a bigger purpose. It doesn't only exist in and of itself or for and of itself. So even like when a little kid tells a knock-knock joke, we might say that's just humorous as a knock-knock joke. But there's something more. It's a child's way of saying, I'm beginning to have a more complex relationship to language. I'm beginning to understand puns, or I'm beginning to understand that one word can have 2 meanings, right? So there is even in the simplest knock-knock joke, there's something deeper going on there, all right? So let me press that then in this particular story, which is there is something more significant going on here than us, Tamar, whoever, making Judah the butt of our joke. And this is where then I want us to begin to think about how the extraordinary resides in the ordinary. This is not the end of the story. There's a few more verses in Genesis 38. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one came out first." But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore he was named Perez, which means breach. Afterwards his brother came out with the crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. That's how Genesis 38 ends. This is how Matthew 1 begins. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and so it goes on. See, I have the Bible. I don't even need a punchline. It's already here.
I thought it was interesting that the Canaanite was deemed to be more righteous than the Jew.
That is huge. That's huge. And then she winds up named in the genealogy of Jesus. So what we can say then, right, as Christians, now of course we have to have a nuanced understanding of the distinction between the Jewish scriptures and our own Christian tradition. But according to the Christian tradition then, without Tamar and what she did, there is no Jesus. Now, there are 5 women in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, including Mary, who also that was a struggle there as well to have this young, pregnant, unmarried girl, right? So that was Jesus' beginning. That was his immediate beginning. But as Matthew outlines this genealogy, there's 4 other women in there, and they're all dodgy, if I can use one of the words of my husband's homeland. They're all dodgy, and one of them we're going to look at next week as well. So I want to go back then to this idea that while we might have some discomfort in this figure of Tamar and what she does, the Bible, not only does the Bible not show discomfort with it, first of all, she's deemed more righteous than Judah, and then she turns up for Matthew in the genealogy of Jesus. So what then becomes the purpose, in a sense, of the humor that we might find in Genesis 38? And I want to make 2 points. First of all is subversion, right? Comedy typically takes on the fight of the underdog. It takes on the cause of the marginalized and the oppressed. And if that's resonating with everything you know about Christianity, it should be. And a lot of times people will say, well, what about, there is what we might call like offensive humor, right? So I would distinguish too between humor that punches up and humor that punches down, because humor that punches up is subversive. It tries to undermine oppressive structures and systems, like Tamar. Humor that punches down is bullying, right? It's not funny for a big kid to hit a little kid. That's not funny. There's no universe in which that's funny, unless you are also a bully and you identify with that behavior. But I would say that's not truly comedy. So comedy takes on this position of underdog and allows them to use whatever they have. And for women, that's going to be their sexuality. And that's okay, because without them, Jesus doesn't get born. Right? So you can't separate those two. Like, you can't clean that up. Right? So then the second thing is, if we can see that subversion happening, that kind of crumbling of structures in this moment, then it becomes also revelatory. So this is another thing that comedy does for us, and it's one of its most powerful functions. It happens individually, and it can happen collectively in a community, a nation, a world, is that it holds a mirror up to us. It reveals us to ourselves, right? So we read this story, and we want to identify with Judah, except we start pumping the brakes. Like, when I keep saying Judah, like, something's coming, right? Right? So we see ourselves in Judah's behavior. He was motivated by fear. He was motivated by self-preservation. He did not want his third son to die. Who can blame him for all this, right? But then he went about it in a way that denied who he was. So comedy can reveal us to ourselves in the way that we see ourselves both in the oppressor and in the underdog. But it can also reveal to us then, if we can see in comedy how things are and the ways that they are that we don't want them to be, then in that moment, there's a writer, Peter Berger, and he talks about this transcendent reality that comedy can reveal to us. That in that moment that we see something that we don't like, it's a prompt for us to imagine what it could look like, transformed, transcendent. And I would say then, to kind of come back to the title, like this is all about the birth of one, and well, they were twins, so 2 baby boys. But there's nothing more ordinary and yet extraordinary in the birth of a child. And as comedy, and this is my kind of closing comment before I'll give you time for questions. There is absolutely nothing more incongruous than the God of all creation taking the form of an infant. And in that sense, then, comedy, I hope you can see, becomes sort of the worldview that we can take on as Christians. That there is an incongruity in who we are as Christians that can challenge both our own understanding of ourselves when we fall short of that, and can challenge the world out there that we look at and say, this is not the reality that we want, it's the reality that we have. But this story of the underdog shows us a transcendent reality, and this is the one that we want to aspire to. All right, I'm ready.
Bring it on. It's hard to me when we talk about the lineage of Jesus. I mean, we could all probably go back in our own lineage and find somewhere along the line that something hadn't. Maybe some subversive activity that is what created us in our entire life. I mean, who knows?
There's some,
So it's just kind of, it's interesting that my point is it's kind of if we thought about it a little more, it's possibly a relatable story to every single one of us, that there might have been some subversive activity in our own lineage that brought about our own being over time.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I think there's a renewed interest, if you can call it that. And there are all these genealogies, and they're mostly in the Old Testament. We get them in the New Testament. Matthew begins with one where people just like, next, right? There is some renewed energy and enthusiasm for these genealogies, and I think it probably parallels our own interest in, what's it called? What's the thing? Ancestry.com and the other ways that people have now to use online information, the tools that we have now to help people go back into their family history, and like the TV shows, the titles are
Who do you think you are?
thank you. Is that the U.S. or
That's
the
the
UK?
British.
That's the UK one, but the one that's on PBS, that Finding Your Roots. Thank you. That there's always surprises, right? And you just don't know once you look back what you're going to find. So there's power in that, and I suspect that, I mean, we want to think that we're rebels, right? But we're also going to look back and find the times when we weren't, when we were Judas. And I think we have to be ready. There's a lesson in this in the way, I mean, we have a current environment in the world that doesn't want us to look honestly back at our own national history, that wants to kind of obscure that and the beginnings of this country where, slavery was part of our own systems, our own structures. And it's ignorant to think that that doesn't still inform our own current reality, right? So there is a powerful lesson here in having the courage to look back and face when you were Judah, but also hope for and build on those times when you were Tamar. Yeah.
It's also interesting that the woman's name was listed in that. You may have spoken to this, but we've always talked about how lot of women are named in the Bible.
Yes,
So I think that's another point.
Yes.
I think that she was included.
absolutely. So you get it. So next year, when you're doing your project of reading through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, which I'm sure you've probably already started planning that out and everything, it is worth taking note. And I say that to be slightly humorous, but anytime you open up the Bible and read a story, a narrative, it is important to note who gets named and who doesn't have a name. And we're going to look at Rahab in Joshua 2 next week, and that becomes significant in that story. So yes, Tamar has a name in the story. And then she is named in the genealogy. And so Matthew takes a curious line through to get to Jesus from Abraham. He carries the women along with him, and that is unusual, and that matters. It really matters. We cannot, again, like trying to look fairly and squarely at the past, we can't deny that this is a patriarchal system, that the whole Bible, not just the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament as well, comes out of a patriarchal system that favors men, and they become the mechanism by which things pass from one generation to another. The accompanying responsibility, and this is where Judah left the bus, is that they also bear the responsibility then of making sure that everybody is cared for in their own household. And Judah messed up on that to the point that he gets clobbered forever. And Tamar is named, and she has agency in that sense.
Do you think that she would have been mentioned if she hadn't been considered righteous in the Old Testament?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I can't answer it. I think it's
held up.
Yes.
Held up.
Yes. So I don't know if everyone heard the question. The question was, do you think she would have been named if she hadn't been deemed righteous? And I think that it's quite possibly not, right? And so the flip side of that is that what she did out of that context of righteousness, and again, remind me to come back to this with Rahab as well. Like out of that context, I think we would probably say what she did was scandalous. And certainly, like if you're looking at the women around you, like your family, your friends, your neighbors, whoever, you're not going to give them advice. Like they're struggling in life. Your advice is not going to be, well, there's this woman in Genesis 38, and let me tell you what she did, right? That's not like the life advice that you're going to give to the women around you necessarily. But, right? This story ends with such, but, right? She was deemed righteous. And that's huge. That's significant. And that recasts everything that happened in the story, including what she did. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, what was her Canaanite tradition for passing down the right of the father to the next generation? Was it similar to what the Israelites did?
So I can't answer that question definitively from knowledge, deep knowledge. It would have. So a bigger question, like I don't know of any contemporary countries around them that would have had a matrilinear succession. There were anomalies of like Jezebel was a queen, and she was Phoenician. So there were other women who held positions of power that would have been via their family in some way or another. But all the systems that I knew of, that I can think of, they would have been patriarchal in the structures. So there's no reason to believe that she would have been better off back with her family. The Hebrew Bible is trying to really hammer home this point that it was Judah's responsibility. Like once he took her in, like she wasn't really, like she was one of them. Whether she was still Canaanite or not, that was sort of beside the point. She was now one of their family, and so he was responsible for her. The story of Ruth and Orpah and Naomi, if you know that story, that's like a parallel story. You know, we accept this in the Gospels, that the Gospels give us 4 versions of the same story. So you get this in different ways in the Hebrew Bible, where you'll have stories that are kind of in conversation with each other, and so you can use them to kind of have a deeper understanding, but you can't harmonize them. So you have to hold them together. So you do have this story where Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah, you'd be better off if you go back to your own people because my future is so dire. That was Naomi's position. Here, though, to bring Tamar in, Judah's responsibility was to continue to take care of her. Of course, he was in fear in his own, much like Naomi, who was driven by fear. Judah was also driven by fear here. He was afraid that his black widow daughter-in-law was going to take care of Shelah as well. That's not a great answer to your question, I don't think, but what the Hebrew Bible is trying to really, really, really make a clear point here is that we've got this extensive instruction in Deuteronomy that this is what he was supposed to do, and he did the opposite thing. Not only did he not allow Shelah to father a child that would become an heir for her, he also sent her away, and that was where she would find safety. We can't also say too little about this. This is how she survives. Like, she doesn't have food if she doesn't have a family. Like, she can't go get a job. She can't, she doesn't have those social mechanisms in place to care for her. Judah was it. And that's why it was so critical. She dies without a family. And he sent her away from that safe place. Now, she did land at her own father's, but so she didn't die. But that was the structure that was set in place for the Israelites to care for one another. This is how they were righteous, to be this way for and to one another in their relationships.
It's interesting, that point, though. So that very structure that we would think is like horrible or not right is the very structure that allowed for all this to happen.
Yes.
And take place.
Yes. So it does. Again, I think this is one of those ways where comedy can allow us to sort of poke fun at the places where we're discontented with what we're reading. But it also prompts us to say, well, how are we now perpetuating these same systems? And I don't need to catalog that list. I'm not really up to it this morning, to be honest. All right? These are difficult days to be a woman right now. So in the ways like that we can recognize that these structures that were meant to care for Tamar didn't care for her. She subverted these structures, but then was still within the structure. Like, this is a complex relationship. Systems always had those complex relationships with those who live in the system. So where do we fit into that? Like, Christians are, our history is to be subversive. Like, we're counterculture. We're not meant to sit there with the Romans. We're not empire dwellers, right? We're kingdom of God dwellers, right? That's our identity. So if we can poke fun at Judah, we recognize how important Judah is, but we can poke fun at him, then that means we can see 2 things. We can see how important Judah is, and we can see where he fell down. And so we can see where we behave like Judah, where we fall down, but we can also then see the places, the exact precise places where we need to get in there and do some change. And we have time maybe for another question, but what I would challenge you to do is to test this all out, is to think about the forms of comedy that you gravitate to and kind of think about what I've said broadly about comedy, and does that apply to, if your thing is late night talk show monologues, Colbert or whoever, or if your thing is sitcoms, whatever your way of enjoying comedy is. Think about what I've said and does it track, right? And how then is it similar or different to what I've said here about the Hebrew Bible? One thing, though, that I do want you to hear me say is, to find something funny is not the same thing as to not take it seriously. Right? That's a double negative, so I'll say it again. To find something funny is not the same thing as not taking it seriously. So if you think about, going back to think about an opening monologue for any late night person who takes on current events, right? The stuff that they're poking at is the stuff that is most important to us as a society, right? So it becomes, because it is so important, it has to be put under the mirror. Under the mirror? No, under the thing. The magnifying glass. Yeah, microscope, thank you. Something that makes it bigger so we can see it better. That thing. So this idea of finding humor in the Hebrew Bible is a righteous endeavor, if I can sort of elevate it in that sense. That it is not in any way to tear away at the fabric of this book, this document that we hold dear. And that we can both, and maybe we're obligated to, both take it seriously and put it under scrutiny. Y'all satisfied to leave it there?
Yes. More questions, I've got a few minutes if there's more.
Yeah. So Joshua 2 next week is the story of Rahab, and maybe just to wet your whistle a little bit. So we have this story of Joshua, Caleb, and the 10 spies. So that story is in Numbers. So I'll tell you where that is. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. That's the fourth book. In Numbers, when the Israelites are about to go into the Promised Land, and Moses sends Joshua, Caleb, and 10 other spies in to spy it out. Fast forward into Joshua. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, right after Deuteronomy. In Joshua 2, there's this story then of Joshua picks 2 spies. That same Joshua, so I'm going to be doing it again, that Joshua, picks 2 spies to go into Jericho, which is Canaanite, and to see what's going on there. And Rahab is a prostitute. And she is. Like Tamar wasn't, Rahab is. Canaanite prostitute. So there are some similarities and some very big differences. So that's the story we're going to look at next week. But again, if you're able to be here next week too, just think about the threads as we talk. You know, what's consistent from this week to that week. And again, just you can bring your questions, comments, observations as well. And thank you.
Thank you.